Good evening.
It's good to see all of you here. I think we're in for I wouldn't say it's going to be a treat. I think it's going to be pretty eye-opening for us. As many of you know, we've been spending about, almost 2 years, year and a half, looking at human trafficking. And so tonight we wanted to make it a little more real, to bring it to what's happening in the local area. So Sister Mary Jo will introduce our speakers, and we're very glad to have all of them here tonight. So thank you for coming, and we know it's going to be a good night.
Joelle just has the statistics in her mind. It's 2.5 years that we've been talking about human trafficking here. And I'm going to turn on the projector so it warms up. Okay, so I'm happy to introduce, first of all, Chief Brian Paulsen. Now, being a chief of police in the town size of Yankton, you've got a lot of administrative duties and a lot of things like that besides police work. And we probably read his name on the front page of the P&D often enough so we kind of get the idea of what he does. And Detective Sarah O'Farrell, who is a detective, and she would be working for sex crimes. So we have this image of everything we know from NCIS and Criminal Minds. But probably not that glamorous. And Desiree Warren Johnson is the Vice President of the Sexual Assault Response Team, of which all three are members on. But we are already familiar with her as the Executive Director of River City Domestic Violence Center. And we know the fine work that they do, and Desiree is extremely professional and caring in everything she does there. And as a board member there, it's a privilege to work with her. So that's all we probably need to say, and we can just let them go. What our plan is their presentation, some time for Q&A, and then we'll stop at 8 o'clock, whether we're done or not, so that those of you who would like to leave or getting sleepy can leave. And if there's still some interest in question and answers, we'll stay a little bit past 8 o'clock then for that. And the focus for this evening is what we are experiencing or what is happening in Yankton in regard to human trafficking as it impacts us locally and in this region in South Dakota.
Good evening.
Hello?
Okay. Good evening. The first thing I want to say is thank you for having us, and the amount of denim that I'm seeing on all you ladies tonight is just invigorating for me. Carly has been working really hard to get everybody in the community in denim today, so she will be excited to hear that all of you ladies were sporting that tonight. So I'm glad that this is a platform that you guys have all taken on in our community, because it's definitely something that's not addressed as it should be in the southeastern portion of the state. And so I think that maybe you guys will give our community the little push that it needs to start addressing it more, so that we can start focusing on the victims that exist with human trafficking in or near our community. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on human trafficking at all. This is relatively new in my line of work as well. But there are many similarities in human trafficking as I see in domestic violence every single day, and I'll talk about that a little bit tonight. So one of the first things that people ask are, who are victims of human trafficking? What does that demographic of people look like? And like we all know, there's not really a single profile for a human trafficking victim. The one thing that we do know about all these individuals is they're vulnerable. They don't have a lot of options. They need love. They're looking for security. Maybe they're looking to fulfill an addiction that they have. All of those things are commonly used to draw people into this industry. The average age of somebody who's entering the sex industry is in between the age of 13 and 14. So this is happening to a lot of juveniles. And I think the reason why that's happening is the children who are in the system, going through foster care, the runaways, the children that have addictions, they feel like they don't have a lot of options. So when this sparkling opportunity comes to them as an adult or a trusted figure telling them that I can make all these things happen for you if you just kind of follow me through this process, it's really easy to latch on to something like that when you feel like you don't have any hope at all. Another area where we're seeing a lot of this is low-income communities. Also an area where people don't have a lot of options, and so they'll look to anything to cling on to, or undocumented immigrants, because there's not a lot of services for them in the United States sometimes, or there's a language barrier or a cultural barrier, and so they're looking for anything to cling on to in those moments, and oftentimes that's how people are drawn into the human trafficking. So if we click to the next one. I added another slide on here because I thought this was very interesting. When I do presentations on domestic violence, I touch a little bit on human trafficking, and I tell people that South Dakota is one of the top 12 worst states for human trafficking in the nation, and people's jaws drop because we're such a rural state. They don't think about things like the rally that's going through and the pipeline that's traveled through, and something that was relatively new to me as of the last couple of years is the hunting season that passes through South Dakota, and all the things that happen with different bars and venues bringing in women and trafficking them out during hunting season. And Chief Paulsen might be able to speak more to that than I can.
I would just add that the entire hunting season is built around sales. So sales of hunting license as well as alcohol, and then the night entertainment. So when our season opens at noon, it allows these hunters to go out, bag their game, and that night go to the bars, and it's almost an open right or an open passage for them to do whatever they would like. And we know that there are women brought in from all over the United States, but predominantly the upper Midwest, a lot out of Minneapolis. So Detroit is another pipeline for the women that come into the state during the hunting season. So it is built around sales, alcohol, including sex.
So just some statistics here. Between 244,000 and 325,000 American youth are considered at risk for sexual exploitation. An estimated 100,000 children are involved in the sex trade in the U.S. annually. Estimated 27 million victims of human trafficking worldwide, and approximately 18,000 to 20,000 victims are trafficked annually in the U.S. 55% of the trafficking victims are women and girls, and 45% are men and boys. And oftentimes we overlook that men and boys can be trafficked as well. 15.4 million victims are aged 18 and older, and 5.5 million are under the age of 18. In South Dakota, and I'm sorry, I don't have any more updated statistics, but in South Dakota, 26 federal sex trafficking cases since 2009, and 15 from the last year. 9 arrests associated with the 2013 rally in Sturgis. We had 2 arrests in Sioux Falls in March of 2014. Over 100 girls and women have been discovered as victims of sex trafficking in South Dakota. There are hundreds of more victims whose cases have never been reported to law enforcement or have been prosecuted. And as Desiree mentioned before, the biggest trafficking, human trafficking in our area is the rally, pheasant hunting, and then also the reservations.
So when Sarah talks about a unique thing to our state, the reservations, 40% of human trafficking victims in South Dakota were reported as Native American. In our community, we have very close proximity to several reservations. We've got the Yankton Sioux Tribe, Ponca, Santee, Landrew. We see a lot of these individuals come through Yankton seeking services through our organization. And if you look at the history of the Native American culture, the selling women and children for sex has been ongoing for years and years and years. And so that's really created a common practice that has been proven very difficult to break. And when you look at the Native American communities, a lot of the human traffickers turn out to be a family member, somebody that they love and trust. There's also a heavy presence of trade for sex for services. So there's no money involved in this, but it's a trade for an active service for things like cigarettes, gas, money, or food. That's happening a lot. And on the reservation, there is often a lack of work. And so there's a lot of poverty that exists there, which often pushes people into making poor choices or being drawn into the lifestyle of human trafficking and being forced into things that they don't necessarily feel comfortable with.
I would add that predominantly men are the traffickers, but I was shocked when I started to really research, started to look at it, where females are 35 to 45% of the offenders. So, which is really, to me, was extremely high. I went into it thinking that maybe 10%, but when you're looking at 35 to 45% of the offenders are women, it becomes even harder. So I would also add on that what we see as our victims of what law enforcement considers as throwaways. Those are the runaways, the kids that are sexually abused, or the homeless. So these kids are out, they've been cast out by their families. And as Desiree alluded to, it becomes a trade of services for sex. And these kids, when she's talking 13 and 14, they don't have a lot of options to raise money for their needs. So it becomes a this for that. We see that in sexual harassment cases called pro bono, where I'll do something for you if you'll do something for me. And that's really carries over into the sex trafficking trade.
All right, so what drives trafficking? We live in a sexualized culture. 77% of 18 to 30-year-old Christian men view porn monthly. It's highly accessible with the internet available at everybody's fingertips these days. You think about when you turn on the TV and sex is selling all the products you see on TV, from Hardee's hamburgers to shampoos. It's always a gorgeous woman, barely dressed, and that's what they're using to sell their products. So who is a trafficker? There is not one type of a trafficking perpetrator. They can be male or female. They're pimps, family members, peers, gang and criminal members, diplomats, business owners, labor brokers, farm owners, factory owners, and companies large and small. So this picture that is shown up here is a picture out of McLennan County in Texas, and that was the fifth human trafficking sting that was conducted, and there were 61 men and women arrested in that sting. And that's how large these groups can become.
So what traffickers are focusing on is filling a need of the victim. They're filling a need that they can later use that need to control that victim, which is very similar to what we see in domestic violence relationships. There's often this misconception in domestic violence that these relationships are dangerous and they're lethal because the abuser has an issue with anger management. But anger management has nothing to do with domestic violence. It's all about power and control. And that is a lot of the dynamic in these human trafficking relationships too. So we see the same dynamic playing out where there's somebody who's hurting or struggling with things in life, facing hardships, and this Prince Charming steps in. and offers everything that this individual might need on a silver platter to get them to comply or to get them to feel loved or needed. And then, like I said, they use all those dynamics to control them. Probably 2 years ago, I had a young woman come into the shelter that I believe was a victim of human trafficking right here in Yankton. She came in because she was leaving a very, very abusive marriage. And they were getting their children taken away because there was heavy drug use within the family. So CPS came in, took the children out. She was using our family visitation center to see her children. And she would often show up, and we would believe that she was under the influence of meth. So I pulled her out of the room, and I was visiting with her, trying to understand more about what her situation looked like. And she let me know that there was an individual in the community that saw her struggling and kind of came in like this angelic being saying, I have all the answers to your problems. I can help you find work. I can help you find a place to live. You don't have any problems anymore. Let me help you. Wrapped his arms around her and made her feel loved like she had never felt before. But in all of this, he also was using her drug use as a tool to control her. So after he built the trust with her, he started using drugs as a way to get sexual favors from her. And she started to pinpoint this the more that she talked to our staff, that this is what he's using this as a means of control. I don't feel comfortable doing these things with him, but he's forcing me to. And then one evening she refused, because victims sometimes get stronger when they get advocacy services. And he pulled a gun on her and told her she didn't have an option anymore. And since then, this individual has been freed from all of this, and she's moved on. She's no longer even in our community. But, I mean, sometimes these things strike really close to home, and we don't even recognize them as human trafficking or things that might actually happen right here in Yankton. So like I said, these relationships are all about control, and they have the same dynamics of domestic violence. You see all of these factors up here, from false promises to physical isolation. A lot of times we see victims of any type of crime that are being isolated from their family and friends, because if you have a support system, it's easier to get out of the difficult situation that you're in. And all of the threats and the manipulation and drug addiction, I think, is a huge part of a lot of this. Brian might be able to shed some more light on that too.
I would agree that the addiction part of it is huge with the victimization of predominantly women, in this case of sex trafficking. I would also add that, you know, the addiction, I say addiction, but it can be drugs and alcohol, but also to, as Desiree and Sarah have alluded to, is pornography. It is so rampant in the United States and across the world. It's $1 billion business, and it becomes nothing for the sexualization of our kids. You know, it's not uncommon for us in law enforcement to know about sexting that's going on in our junior high and our high school. And the actual trading of photographs is a market where they tell the other one what they want to do or what they're willing to do via text message. And when we as adults get comfortable with that information in texting, they change and they go to Snapchat. And from Snapchat, they've gone to, I don't even know what the new one is. My youngest is a senior now, so I don't get a lot of information. But I'm also aware of every smartphone comes with a calculator. Well, there's now a fake calculator that you can hide everything in. So, and I don't remember how, but I have looked at his phone, and he has the actual calculator. But there's a passcode to your phone. There's a passcode to get into this fake calculator. And that's where these kids are hiding all that stuff. When they're seeing that on a daily basis, multiple times a day, it becomes easy to victimize them as predators. And unfortunately, those folks exist. The third thing that I think heavily contributes is mental illness. You know, in society, when we have kids that have attachment disorder and they're looking for that love and they've never experienced love, even the smallest portion of false love gives them hope. And obviously, we know from the outside, having been through or experienced relationships and breakups, we know what's fake and what's not. Some of us are fooled at times, but not to the record amount or to the horrific amount that these young kids are. So it really pornography, addictions, and then mental illness.
So like we just talked about, there's a lot of glamour in the beginning when people are being prospected to be part of these things that are happening. But in the reality, there's a lot of very bad things, as we all know, that happen to these victims. A lot of sexual abuse, a lot of physical abuse, a lot of trauma. And we'll talk about that in a little bit.
So where are the victims targeted? Everywhere. Online, shopping malls, bus stops, schools, after-school programs, foster homes, group homes, anywhere with the younger generation, anywhere where the younger kids are going to hang out is prime areas for the offenders to make contact with them, to begin to try to lure them. Areas where victims work, again, it's everywhere. For sex trafficking, you know, you got your beauty salons, casinos, hotels, motels, restaurants, strip clubs, where there's that personal interaction with individuals. And then for the labor trafficking, you've got retail businesses, private homes, construction companies, things like that.
So when Sarah talks about the other human trafficking for the labor, that's about 20% of the cases that are seen. 80% is for the sex, and then the other 20% really falls into the labor market. And if you're familiar with, I'm going to say about 10 years ago, maybe 11, 2007, 2006, Chamberlain, South Dakota, those Filipino women were cleaning the hotel during the day and were sex slaves at night. And during that investigation, some of those ladies hadn't been asleep or hadn't gotten any sleep in 3 days straight during their interviews when they started talking about it, which is a horrific strain on the human body. So for those women to get out, it took just the courage of one woman to reach out to law enforcement up there, but there were so many of them that were involved, and they were dual, where we had labor during the day and then the sex trade at night.
So I think one of the reasons why we're here today is to talk about how all of you ladies can help. And I think something that is difficult for our community to recognize is why all of them should help. And I think it's hard for people to wrap their heads around that even if they never meet anyone or never know anyone that's a victim of human trafficking, we're all paying the cost of every individual that is victimized with anything. Because with any type of victimization, there's a lot of risk factors that people will use risky behaviors. There is mental health issues and diseases that can cause a financial toll on the community. And trauma untreated is passed on, and it's just an endless cycle. And so that's what I'm very, very hopeful as an advocate, that we can work with all of you guys to spread this message and to help educate the community on how this is occurring in our state, in our community, and shed light on it. I saw an image on online today when I was looking through some human trafficking things, and it was a billboard that said, "We don't have a bigger problem in Tennessee with human trafficking, we're just addressing it," because they had more numbers reported than several other states across the nation. And I sort of have the same philosophy with domestic violence in the community. Several years ago, when Chief Paulsen came on, we were looking at different initiatives that we could take to address domestic violence in our community. And one of the things that we did was start completing a lethality assessment with every victim who dialed 911. And I remember Chief Paulsen telling our response team at that time that our numbers are going to increase. They're going to go up before they go down again, and not to be alarmed by that. And so I've always taken that insight from him and brought that to the community and said, I don't believe that there's an increase in domestic violence. I believe that now people feel more comfortable coming forward and reporting some of these things. And so I think we take the same initiatives with human trafficking as we have with domestic violence and sexual assault and shed light on a lot of these things.
So since we want to help, we need to know what to look for. And there's some few key things on here. Things to look for or to be aware of. Runaways or juveniles talking about running away. 4 or more runs from home increase the likelihood of child sexual exploitation by 100%. So the more the child runs from home, the more likely it's going to happen. Also mentioned on here are something else to look for is property tattoos. A lot of times the victims are tattooed by the individuals trafficking them, showing ownership of that person and showing ownership to other traffickers. Other things to be aware of. People all of a sudden having more money than they used to have or having nicer things than they used to have.
This is just a continuation of other things to look for. Lies about age, maybe not necessarily knowing where they're at if they're traveling. But at the end of all of this, there's a lot of things that we can all look for when we see things that look strange or give us a bad gut feeling. But how to approach them is completely another topic that I'm going to touch on a little bit, and then I think that Chief Paulsen will have good advice on this. What I know from my history with domestic violence and sexual assault is sometimes approaching these individuals when you see something bad happening to somebody is not a good idea, because that can put that victim in a higher rate of danger. And so there's lots of different things that we can do to help that are not approaching the situation or putting yourself in danger while you're doing that. So do you have any recommendations on the steps that people can take, Chief Paulsen, when they see something?
Obviously, the first thing is don't be afraid that it isn't what you think it is. I have a daughter who is in Washington, D.C. right now on her internship. My last advice to her was, trust your gut. If your gut tells you that it's wrong, get away. And so trust your gut. If you see something, say something. Now that's a moniker of Homeland Security with terrorism, but it applies to everything. One of the things that it always makes me turn around, whether I'm in a vehicle or walking or just watching people, is a middle 20s man talking to a 14-year-old girl. And it's not uncommon. My wife doesn't say anything anymore. She used to ask me what I thought I was doing, but she kind of understands now that I'll turn around in a parking lot and go park and watch just to see what's going on. If they separate, the girl goes into the store and he leaves, I'm perfectly fine with that. But at any point where I think that he is being forceful or trying to lure her, then I take action. And that's generally to call a cruiser, because honestly, I don't want them to know that I'm watching, because if they don't know how it was discovered, I think we have an advantage to that. I'll let the uniformed officer go up and make the contact, and then I'll provide the information. So another thing is that we all have those kids or know those kids that need just a little bit of push, of love, and if we reach out to them as well. Somebody that is just starving for attention. 5 minutes makes a big difference. If I spend 5 minutes talking to one of the kids up at the Boys and Girls Club, I think that makes a huge difference, because that's 5 minutes if there's not a predator or somebody that's going to prey on them, and I know that they're safe for that period of time. And I try to get that information or get that whole concept out to law enforcement in general, and that is that we need to spearhead this movement. We have great resources in our community. We can always do better, but we can always do better as a police department. I think that if we had to isolate or get a victim away, we could easily put them in the shelter, and I would feel very comfortable with that. And then we would work on the resources or future help or the extended help that those victims would need.
All right, so part of my job is I am part of the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force for South Dakota. And part of that job is taking tips from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children regarding online crime, sex crimes involving children. And so I just want you guys to be aware that children and teens are big targets for predators online. Predators may give the victim the attention they are seeking. So youth nowadays turn to what they call their friends online, who are actually complete strangers who they've never met, and they consider these people to be their friends. They establish relationships with them, and I mean, it can go into years-long relationships. So they feel comfortable, they feel safe talking to these individuals, and these predators take advantage of that. They can isolate that victim by turning them against family and friends. When teens are having a tough time and they're voicing their frustrations or the problems that they're having in their lives at that point in time, the predator will take that and twist it and let them know how much better it would be with them than for them to stay at home. They lie, make promises of a better life. Tell them, you can come and stay with me. You can, I will give you money. I will make sure you guys, you go to school. I'll buy you new clothes. They just promise this much better life. And once they are actually able to lure that victim with them, that's when it gets changed to, go with this friend of mine. I want you to meet somebody else. And then this child gets passed around. And this is, like I said, very common thing because of the access everybody has to everybody else through the internet.
With that, I would just make the comment that it's a dark subject. In 2017, the federal government, the Congress, believe it or not, actually did something in 2017, and they passed the Fight of Online Sex Trafficking, FOST 2017. It wasn't implemented until late March, maybe early April of this year. So a lot of sex trafficking was passing through Craigslist, and once Craigslist kind of dialed it up a little bit on their surveillance and was giving information to law enforcement, it moved to what is called Backpage, and they were both shut down by the federal government. I don't know about Backpage, I've never had enough courage even as a law enforcement officer to go to Backpage, but I have gone to Craigslist since that announcement, and all the personal ads on Craigslist are gone. And there used to be thousands of them. And you could go from city to city and solicit sex through Craigslist. So I would assume that Backpage is the same way. If you go to Craigslist, it actually says because of Faust 2017, we no longer offer personal ads. So that's a huge movement. It's a win for our representation in Washington, D.C., but unfortunately, once those two shut down, there's something else, and it's even going to be darker, or it's even going to be on the dark web, which will mean we'll have to find it. Law enforcement will have to work a little harder to find it. I think we're up to that task, but as soon as we find one thing, they close it down and they move to the next.
So on those sites, the Backpage sites, stuff like that, they post things on there. It's basically a shopping list, looking specifically for certain things, and that's how the traffickers know what to look for when searching for their next victim, because people are posting exactly what they want. What they want this person to look like, how old they want them to be, and so, like I said, it's a shopping list. Specifically, what do they want, and specifically, what can I go find? So it's just a scary, scary situation out there.
So we do have some options. We don't have things in place to respond to human trafficking to the degree that I think all of us would like in our community, but we definitely have some options in place, because the one thing we know is that human trafficking has a lot of similarities to the dynamics of domestic violence. So we know that when somebody does get out of that way of life, there is a extreme threat of danger. Just like in domestic violence, the most dangerous time for a victim to leave, or the most dangerous time for a victim is when they leave, because they are defying that power and control. So, like Chief Paulsen said, we have a very safe and secure shelter. We have great law enforcement that do extra patrol by the organization when we need it there. Our organization would be able to provide a lot of things like safety planning with them. Sometimes we work with the police department on that if it's a very intense situation, so that we can keep the victims safe. We have off-site locations where we can put victims, so that if the shelter is identified as a safe haven for someone, they're not in danger there. We also have options for transporting the victim to other locations, especially in a human trafficking case. I think it would be very important to get them to another destination that they cannot be found. And we have relationships with shelters across the nation and are able to do that very easily. We also have access to helping victims fill out crime victim compensation forms. So if they have expenses that need to be paid because of things that they've endured through being a victim, we can help fill out that paperwork for the state for them. We also do a lot of protection order work, and we can help with things like that, or courtroom accompaniment. I think one of the biggest barriers that our community lacks right now, of course, is a lack of knowledge, professionals, and the general community. And so I think all of us together in this room tonight can make that one of our personal platforms to get that going for our professionals and to get it going for our community, because the best way to get a response out of people is to create a presence. And we've done a lot of that through our response team. We've had commercials on TV that were several different community leaders, several different disciplines in the community saying, I start by believing when somebody tells me that they've been sexually assaulted. And when victims know what to expect when they come forward, I truly, truly believe that it makes it a lot easier to come forward if you know that you're going to get that warm embrace from people and they're going to believe what you're saying. And so that should probably be one of the forefronts that we're working on as we move forward with this. And I know I've talked to Sister Mary Jo, you guys have a lot of ideas on different things that you can do in the community. We've talked about the Truckers Against Trafficking app, that's a group. There's an app that you can download on your cell phone that provides all kinds of resources for what to do if you see something like this happening. One of our advocates has actually been working with a group of you sisters to develop some potty posters, I think is what Sister Mary Jo calls them. We do that a lot for our domestic violence services too, because where's a more intimate and sacred place is behind a bathroom door where there's nobody there watching what you're doing. And if you can pull a quick little tab and stick it somewhere safe so that you have access to call a number when you do have a phone, that's great. There's been a lot of commotion too with, there's a new app out where they're encouraging people to take pictures of the carpet of the hotel rooms that they're staying in, so that when they are searching for someone, they can identify the different types of carpet in all the hotel rooms across the nation. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would just add that we're playing catch up. This has not been a crime that law enforcement has spent a lot of time with 10 years ago. I would say in the last 5 years, we've taken some action. I will tell you that it's not a real strong presence in the state as far as the investigations. The arrest that Sarah mentioned earlier at Sturgis, I used to work the rally. All that was taking little cards and putting them in the men's bathroom. And there was a phone number on the card, and they were calling him in. The person on the other end of the phone was a undercover officer who portrayed himself as an underage boy or girl, and it went from there. So that was a sting operation. It still occurs. I want to say last year, I think I heard 8 arrests. So it hasn't spiked, but then it's not an aggressive movement as well. As soon as I said earlier, as soon as they change, as soon as we discover something, they change how they operate. It's just going to be one step ahead. But it's going to take a huge movement, and it can't be just law enforcement. It can't be just a women's shelter or women advocacy. It's going to be, everybody's got to come to the table. I think, I'm going to brag here a little bit, I think that Yankton is ahead of everybody else because of our sexual response team and the disciplines that we have at the table once a month when we're talking about these cases. When our first human trafficking victim appears, I know we'll have the resources to put a lot of different parts in motion, but when we sit down and discuss that case at our sexual assault response team meeting, there will be a lot of players. So court services, the shelter, probation, the hospital, even though we lost our ED director, everybody else at the table, law enforcement, victim witness from the Division of Criminal Investigations. So those are all part of it, and when we do have our first victim. Locally, we ran a sting about a year ago. It was one of our ladies downtown, one of the strippers, for no better title, was promising to bring young girls over, and she identified them as under 16 years of age. That was set up through both Craigslist and Backpage, and there was a running dialogue between undercover officers and that particular woman. She never did produce the 2 girls, the 2 underage girls, so they thought about just charging her with prostitution because it had already been set up even though things hadn't changed. It became a little more complicated than that. We actually made a decision at the state and the local level to not pursue the prostitution charges on her because we were more interested in getting the information back to Minneapolis, and she was basically prostituting these 2 young girls. We're confident that she was doing that. We just didn't get it down here, and if Minneapolis took action, it's all the better.
So I think the biggest thing that has happened in recent years is realizing that there are victims and not just looking at it as those individuals are involved in prostitution. For so many years, those victims were being arrested and charged and being looked at as criminals and not being looked at as a victim. And I think, we're in a better place now, taking a look at that and realizing that they are victims and they do need our help.
Do you guys have any questions for us?
You had listed, and you had it above there on the screen, the number of people arrested, I think, at the rally. Who exactly is arrested? You have the victim, you have a person trying to buy services, and then you might have an overall person who's running the whole business. Who gets arrested?
Okay, so those sting operations, there's not an actual victim. It's undercover law enforcement that's making those arrangements. So with those particular situations, there's not a true victim. It's a sting operation. And then the ones that are being arrested are the ones that are making the arrangements, the offer for payment, and that type of situation.
All right, so the people who want to buy, okay, are they arrested ever?
Yes,
They are,
yes.
okay. Probably people underage, or what gets them arrested?
So there's the communication that goes back and forth, whether it's text messaging or it's through a web page or anything like that. It really starts off as that phone number in the bathroom. And once the person reaches out, they'll set up what their, and I'm going to be very crude with this term, order, whether it's a boy or a girl, what age, or whatever their preferences are. As soon as they arrive at, and then it's set up to go to a hotel. And as soon as they arrive at the hotel, there doesn't have to be any money exchanged, and they make the arrest immediately there. They're charged federally, and I believe from last year, there's still one out there that they're still prosecuting. The rest of them all plead, and that's generally what happens is they'll plead out because they know the evidence is against them when they have all the electronic messaging that's going back and forth.
I get the sense that it's a little difficult to prosecute these folks, to find them and prosecute them.
I would agree. I think it's getting easier to find them because law enforcement is on this fast track of education and awareness. I would have guessed that 10 years ago, when let's go back 8 years, when I interviewed and I asked them the question, always at the end of my interview, or your interview, you get to ask them questions. What's the drug problem like in Yankton? Well, we don't have a drug problem. I was driving home with my wife and I said, that's a bunch of BS. I said a little more louder, a little more longer than that, but I said 29 and 50, running so close, or 81 and 50. There's a big drug problem. And I believe that that same pipeline for drugs is the pipeline to move victims. They'll have a schedule where they'll rotate them. One of the biggest fears I had was when Super 8 out by Minerva's by Best Western changed hands. I wanted to know who the new owners were and who was cleaning their rooms. That was the first question I had. I didn't care what the purchase price was or anything like that. So law enforcement, and I'm not picking on prosecution or the court system, but law enforcement has to be the almost first gear in this transmission. We've got to get better at finding them, making that arrest. Prosecution needs to catch up, and the courts need to catch up on the education and the awareness. And we really have to get past the fact that these kids are criminals. They are victims. They're not, I'll be honest with you, it's been a long time since I was 14, but I never ever thought about sex. And I never ever would have thought about selling myself for sex. So for that idea to even be floated out there, it should not even be allowed.
When you mentioned that perpetrators plead out, does that mean they get no jail time or they pay fines?
Not necessarily. Most of the time in the federal court, they end up going and serving time. And I probably should have called up to the U.S. Attorney's Office and asked what the sentencing for the last 15 or 20 of them were, but you'll see 5 years in a minimum security prison. Generally not a big fine, but $1,000, maybe $2,000. We're not looking at $5,000 or $10,000 by any means. And then they're on federal probation. Most of them plead. Very few of them want to go to trial because it's public and it gets out there. And they don't want to keep their name out of the paper as much as possible. Most of them are not from South Dakota. I don't know what that percentage would be, but in seeing the list of people arrested, particularly in the Sturgis rally, most of them are from other states, not from South Dakota. I will tell you that East River, I think that we're going to see an increase in human trafficking with the Denny Sanford Center. They're starting to host NCAA regional basketball or quarterfinal basketball, and then they've got some other divisions of athletics, other categories of athletics, and that is a big draw. One of the biggest, if not the biggest, human trafficking in the United States is the Super Bowl, and they come in from all over the world. I'm fully aware that with the College World Series in Omaha, Nebraska, huge human trafficking event down there. And when they're done there, they're traveling somewhere else. And I think as we develop and we start attracting, and Denny Sanford starts attracting more and more to the center, I think we're going to see an increase there.
know teenagers think they are immune from everything and they know everything, but could part of the solution be educating these preteens and teens about the dark things that lurk out there and how to protect themselves and their friends?
Yes, we have done some stuff within the schools. I just, a few weeks ago, was at the Gayville Volun School speaking about internet safety and online predators. Officer Dan Thompson, our school resource officer here in Yankton, along with myself and Eric Jonke and a couple others. A few years ago, we did go up to the high school and address the entire school as a whole, just to explain, these are the laws, this is the kind of stuff to avoid. But I do think it's something that should be brought up every year, and we do a sexting presentation every year. But I think we need to go a little bit deeper with the online predators as well.
I'm 76 years old and still trying to figure out how to send an email.
Can't hear you.
I'm 76 years old and still trying to figure out how to send an email. And I see a 12-year-old child with, I assume it's a cell phone or some kind of device. I mean, how much access does that 12-year-old have to the internet world that a parent wouldn't even have a clue, well, with your grandparent, clue of what that child may be doing? And I think that has to be, I would think it'd be an extremely difficult issue.
It is a huge issue. If they have a cell phone, if they have a tablet, they have access to everything online. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Pictures, videos, contact with other individuals. And it is very difficult to supervise a child with that phone. I think it starts with education within the home, and setting boundaries within that home. Kids don't need to take their cell phones to bed with them at night. There's no reason for it. Encourage parents to take that cell phone at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, and they can have it back in the morning, but there's no need for them to be having that phone alone with them all night long when they can be on the internet, looking at things they shouldn't be looking at, or having conversations with people they shouldn't be having conversations with. There are different parental controls that can be set up where you can cut off the internet access from that phone, but that really only works for that phone. So if a child connects to wireless internet elsewhere, within the home or within the school, they still have access. So there's safeguards set up, but there's also ways to get around it too.
That's a good example of how it changes. So I'm talking about the perpetrators and how they'll go from, well, how they went from Craigslist to Backpage. So what do kids do? You take their phone away, and what do the manufacturers of electronics do? My son has a PlayStation 4. He can communicate with any of his friends through his PlayStation. I really don't worry about him because he also realizes and knows that we bought a program called Covenant Eye that alerts, and his mom and I take it very serious, and he knows it. We don't try to hide it from him. It's not a surprise. I want him to know that, guess what, your dad's a cop, your mom's a social worker, you're not going to get away with anything for very long. So, but he buys that PlayStation, and one of the rules in our house is, doesn't go to your bedroom, it stays down here. So him and I might have a few disagreements when I want to watch television. He wants to be on his PlayStation. But the kids change as fast as these perpetrators are. It was already said, and I remember this. I still remember this. I'm 55 years old, and I remember when I was 15, the world couldn't stop me. There was nothing that could hurt me. And these kids still have that attitude today. Rightfully so, it's part of that whole growth and development, but we've given them so many other opportunities to reach out across the world.
Here's our last question.
Okay, so when I was growing up, we used to hear about prostitution rings. So what's the difference between a prostitution ring and human trafficking? How are they similar or alike? Do all human trafficking start off as prostitution?
The only thing that has changed since when you were growing up and how it changed from prostitution to human trafficking is that we now recognize that underage boys and girls are being victimized. Prostitution used to be believed or was believed to be adults who were caught up in sexual addictions or through a pimp or however they were connected into that ring. The federal government actually came in and defined it, saying that now sex trafficking is all individuals. So you have rings of sex trafficking. And so you don't hear about a lot of rings of prostitution anymore. It's identified through the courts who the victims are, who the perpetrators are by age. So obviously they don't release the age of the minors, but on the adults they do. So it really just, the definition widened. You know, I'm happy to say that when I was 15 years old, I don't know that there was sex trafficking going on. I'm sure there was, but not to the magnitude it is today.
Any other comments? Okay, we'll take a little break for those of you that are finished, and if somebody want to hang around and ask more questions or discuss, you're free to. So while we're all here, we want to thank you very, very much for